Labour talk about being considered, making considered decisions. What is considered about signing up to a $368 billion at least contract with the US after 24 hours? What's considered about signing an agreement that does not deliver an outcome or a good for the country? What's considered about buying nuclear attack submarines whose only job will be not to defend Australia, but to assist the US if they attack China? These are crazy decisions. They are not considered. They are ill-considered. They should be changed.
Hello there, welcome to Bogan Intel. The next guest we have today is former Labor Senator Doug Cameron. It's great to have Doug on to today's episode to speak essentially about the modern Labor Party in Australia. Doug will be speaking a little bit about the trade union background of the Labor Party, how that might be affected in today's modern environment. He talks about the working class and how they have lost connection with the Labor Party, as well as critiquing of some of the party's policy decisions that see it appear to favour neoliberal economic policies in favour of broad national programs that could transform our country. And Doug gives a very candid and respectful critique of the party he's served his life at. With no further ado, please enjoy Doug Cameron. Thank you very much for joining us today, Doug Cameron.
No worries, Joel.
I think it's a great opportunity here to have you on to speak about your experience. Well, firstly, as someone from the working left, someone who's a trade unionist, and also someone who's a part of the left faction of the Labor Party. I would like firstly to sort of get your a little bit of your background about where you're from and what got you into trade unionism and the labour movement.
Well, I suppose my commitment to trade unionism was as part of my heritage back in Scotland, where you went to work, you joined the union. And a long history of fighting for working class values, a long history of, fighting to advance workers' rights. That's where I learnt my trade unionism, when I served my apprenticeship. Then I came to Australia 1973 along with my wife and my oldest daughter, and ended up working at Liddell Power Station in the Hunter Valley as a fitter, became the site convener, was involved in unions, and then ended up the local organizer, then into Sydney as an assistant state secretary, assistant national secretary, and then national secretary of the union.
Okay, so we have a proper working class person who studied an apprenticeship, who completed an apprenticeship, and then joined with your hands as a worker, as a fitter and turner. Firstly, I would like to ask you, growing up in such a strong union environment in Scotland, you came to Australia, in the early 70s?
Came 73, yeah.
Yeah. So you would have come to Australia at a pretty exciting time guarding unions, with the Whitlam era breathing a kind of new life into the Australian movement and potentially globally as well. But then you also got to sit at the executive of unions in the post-Accord era under Hawke, and got to see the sort of shifting sands, I suppose, as it came to how unions interacted with the Labor Party and how they did business with them. And I was just wondering if you could maybe paint a little bit of a picture with the difference between the British union movement and the Australian union movement, pre and post-Accord.
Well, it's going to be pretty difficult for me to do that because I spent all of my adult life in Australia. I was a member of the union as an apprentice in Scotland, and then emigrated when I was 21. And as I said, spent most of my working life in Scotland, in Australia, after serving my apprenticeship in Scotland.
So you were really an Australian worker for most of your life. But may I ask you then how you saw the union movement change, being heavily involved pre and post Accord, and what you feel the changes were, what you witnessed with your fellow comrades?
Well, I suppose the strength of the union movement is a key issue. The union movement was really strong when there was big, mass workshops, engineering workshops, manufacturing workshops. The workers recognized the benefit of the union movement. We went through that whole process of, fighting for, award conditions, fighting for above award wages, making sure that we could use the strength of what we called the hot shops in the manufacturing sector to spread benefits across the country. And the employers got onto that. Some, political parties got onto that and decided that they didn't want, pattern bargaining, industry bargaining, and that they would try and focus everything back at the enterprise level to, fragment the strength and capacity of the trade union movement.
Was there, well, I mean, also in that period, the ACTU changed its remit and the way it did business, right? It went from a more kind of a adversarial relationship with Labor to a more collaborative one. Can you shed a little bit more light on this?
Look, I think I don't know that it was more collaborative. I think, though, I mean, the reason the union movement came about, the Labour Party came about, was because the union movement recognized that there was a limit to what you could achieve by industrial action at the workshop or even industry level. So the union movement has always recognized the importance of engaging in, political work. In fact, it was the union movement in Australia that created the Labour Party. So it's not something new about working with the Labour Party, but it's certainly an issue where, we could work much more effectively if the union voice was stronger.
And many of the people joining the Labor Party in this period came from the working class and from the trade union sector. So I suppose there was a little bit of an incentive to ensure that that the trade union way of life and the objectives and requirements of the Australian worker were carried into Canberra. But at some point, there was a new class of people that started inhibiting union leadership roles and party roles themselves. And there might have been some reassurance from them that they would still be, fighting for the old values and the old systems that matter so much. But we did end up seeing a lot more of a bureaucratic approach to unionism, where, the blue collars turned into white collars. And there seemed to be a shift in the way that the union perceived its role with parlaying with Canberra. Now, is this a thing? I mean, I know that the unions of the Labor Party, of course, are joined at the hip, and they have been since day dot. But there was a period after the neoliberal reforms where the ACTU tried to breathe a whole new style of going about things into the unions, whereby there was co-authors on policy coming from the union and the Labor Party by the 2000s. Now, do you think that this is this was a trend or a slide that saw the conditions that we see today?
No, I don't. I think it's a good thing. The whole approach to ensuring that workers can get access to a social wage is fundamental to building a good society. You don't want a position like in the United States where, if you had a well-paid, well-organized union job, it was the only way you could get access to, decent wages, access to healthcare. The Australian trade union movement took a different view. We took the view that you had to have access to a strong social wage, health, education, decent wages, workers' rights. I don't think that has ever changed in the union movement. I really don't. I just think what has changed is the fragmentation of the movement through enterprise bargaining, the demise of the manufacturing sector, which used to set the wages and conditions for workers across the country, because it was well organized, it had was well funded, had strong membership, could go out there and fight for decent wages, decent conditions, and industrial democracy. That has weakened because the industries in Australia have fragmented. Now you see where there is still big volumes of workers in some of the, like the white collar areas, in education, in retail sector. Still a lot of union members there. But when the base of the manufacturing sector was basically destroyed through the demise of the car industry, the approach of the coalition towards antagonistic industrial relations instead of working collectively. That is a big problem.
But after 10 years of the coalition, which was preceded by a short Labor period and preceded by another long period of the coalition, where John Howard, put through the work choices legislation that kind of changed the whole lay of the land. I personally was working at a factory in Melbourne's north, looking to one of those great factory careers, involved in the AMWU and all that sort of thing. And I was one of the last people to kind of to almost have that opportunity to get in there, and a bit of dithering. And before you knew it, the jobs had all changed, and I went back to apply, and those old jobs that were there that kind of kept families in Melbourne's north paying off their mortgages and potentially going on a holiday once a year, we're no longer there. And my whole generation has been denied access to this kind of to this kind of work, and the dignity that comes through it, and the identity that comes with it as well. And there are many people that worked at the Ford factory in Campbellfield and the Nestle factory and all these factories that I knew that were quintessential parts of my growing up, and the friends who, some of them had multi-generations working at these factories. Some of them still can't find their identity in the post work choices landscape. And I suppose I want to ask you a little bit that, yes, after the coalition really has declared war on the Australian worker and the conditions that they live in, can we attest a little bit of blame towards Labor here for coming in now with a Chifley mandate and essentially not doing anything for this neglected group of people? In fact, actually parlaying with the business community to potentially declare war with the ACTU on entities like the CFMEU. So is it possible that we can blame modern Labor a little bit for the condition of the unions and the workers' movement that we have today?
Well, I don't think you can blame Labour for the corruption in the CFMEU. That's a ridiculous proposition. The issue for unions is that a lot of people who many years ago would have went to university didn't have that opportunity, ended up working in the manufacturing sector, production lines across the country. And people like Laurie Carmichael, John Halfpenny, these people could have made a brilliant career anywhere they wanted. but they were in the trade union movement and they brought that capacity there. So look, I don't want to we shouldn't estimate the demise of mass production in Australia and the effect that has on declining union membership. In fact, that's what Trump is arguing in the US to try and attract disaffected workers in the US, that he'll bring jobs back to America, that he's a friend of the union movement. What a deceitful approach that is. And you can see a bit of that being pushed recently in Australia, where the Libs are now saying, "Oh, we recognise the unions, and we think there should be manufacturing jobs, and you can't you can't deal with the environment because it'll affect jobs." Well, they've never been worried about jobs in their life. The only jobs they were interested in was their own.
It reminds me of Tony Abbott. He had to give out a reasonably little bailout package to save the Holden and Ford plants there, and that never happened. Now I know, in Hastings, harkening back to the 50s and talking about Tiranas and things like that. Yeah. And, it's a bit of a dangerous thing when the right side of politics is able to talk to disenfranchised workers on any level and make some kind of traction. And I want to go on to that a little bit later on and speak to the fact that there are many people in trade union jobs that aren't as sympathetic to left and progressive politics anymore. And they're paying their dues, but politically they're quite, they're on an island almost in this country. Look, I want to sort of speak to, the change in the methodology and the projection of the modern Australian Labor Party. And look, I mean, since its inception, the ALP has been defined, and it's defined itself as the party of the working class. But in the new millennium, the Labor Party has changed the way it's approached the polis and the polity, and now looks to cut out a swathe of Middle Australia to essentially to hold its mandate. That mandate now is the most amounts of seats since the Chifley government, which is quite incredible. So what is the Labor Party in 2025? That's the question, I suppose. Is it a social democratic force? Is it a centrist blob? Or is it something else entirely?
Look, it's very difficult to sort of be definitive, because political parties change, their values ebb and flow. The Labour Party is no different. I think that neoliberalism is still a big issue in the Labour Party. The reason I joined the Labour Party and have continued to be in the Labour Party now for many, many decades was that I wanted to influence how the Labour Party operated and the policies that it adopted. Neoliberalism is still, we had the free trade arguments, and I strongly opposed this push to just have free trade. There had to be, in my view, if you were going to trade, it had to be fair. So all of those debates have taken place in the party over the years. I'm just a bit disappointed that the party now has such a strong mandate and it's not dealing with what I think are some of the key issues towards building a good society. And from my perspective, taxation is an issue. Negative gearing and capital gains tax is driving up house prices. Simply providing more and more support for young people to get a deposit and then placing them in long-term debt, debt that they might never pay off, is a problem. accepting that the housing market has to be based on a home, home ownership, and forgetting that there's a need for those people that will never have the capacity to access housing is an issue for me. I think there's a need for a modern housing commission. I think there's a need for the federal government to start building public housing and learn from the lessons and the problems of the past, but build homes that are affordable for people that can never buy and rent. I was disgusted when, I heard a Labour minister say they weren't interested in housing as a human right. They were only interested in building more homes. And the focus seems to be on home ownership. And that is not where everyone is. It's great if everyone can own a home, but that's not the reality. And there's a need to look after those Australians who will never be able to own a home. And if Labour doesn't do that, then I think there's going to be a rising problem of inequality, a rising division within the country, and we need to deal with it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree. And the one thing that sticks out there is neoliberalism. And, potentially Labor being the champions of neoliberalism through Hawke and Keating, potentially are the most reticent to give it the flick when it comes to looking at some of the problems it's causing. I mean, we're just looking at that Four Corners report into the childcare sector. It seems like everything that's a neoliberal, any initiative that's done with these kind of collaborative private interests, from the NDIS to childcare to build to rent housing, is by day one inflicted with a spate of problems that only seem to grow and compound, in a relatively short period of time. It seems, as you say, crazy that this Labor Party, with such an incredibly impressive mandate, can't put out a policy to build 1 million public homes and leave a legacy that could last for generations. And I'd like to speak a little bit about legacy and the perceived value of it amongst your mobs in Canberra, because it used to be a currency that was traded with a little bit more respect, but now it seems to be a penny stock that sits at the bottom of any other consideration. And speaking towards that neoliberalism, and that mandate, they can't seem to get across a gambling reform, or like a super tax on 3 million plus super holdings. So, things like a housing overhaul or a tax reform or a bold national initiative just seem like on another planet. Do you think this is due to a lack of courage or political obsession, or is this now like the party's DNA to parlay with the business class and to pay lip service to the Australian worker?
I hope not. I just think that one of the issues that really got us off in government on a bad foot was never break a promise. Now, it's really good if politicians can deliver on their promises, but when circumstances change, you've got to have the courage, you've got to have the wisdom, and you've got to have the capacity to change things when circumstances change. And I think that was one of the first problems we had, where the party was determined to prove that it would maintain all of its promises. And I thought, the third tier tax cuts had to go. I thought that was wrong. I thought negative gearing and capital gains tax should go. And hopefully, leading up to the next election, a Labour government can say and can understand the economics of where we're at, go to the next election promising to get rid of negative gearing, capital gains tax, and make taxation fairer. These are the things that we need to do. We need to make sure that the resources sector is properly taxed. There's a huge capacity for Labour to do good things, but they seem to be completely enveloped in this AUKUS insanity that is driving everything at the moment. So I mean, Labour does good things in government. This government does some good things, but it's really being diminished by this approach of embracing, militarism, embracing the US hegemony, being the deputy sheriff to the United States. These are crazy things for the government to be entertaining. And I think it will come back and bite them.
If you're enjoying this program and the other ones we're putting together, please take your time to like and subscribe. It makes a really huge difference in pumping this channel and getting it out to a wider audience. As a burgeoning politics program on YouTube, the algorithmic soup keeps us in all sorts of weird situations. And sometimes it needs a bit of a push from people like yourself to get our program into the airwaves. So thanks for staying and enjoy the rest of the show. It does feel like potentially over the last decades since Labor, came back up post Howard, the rules or the chips on the board had moved around a fair bit, and there was this effort to vie to be the partner of choice to Washington. I mean, you could see Dutton doing his version of it in the last election. I don't have a chance of winning the election, but if you want me to be your authoritarian partner of choice, I'm willing to be the next Marcos or the next Malay character in Australia. Now, I'm not saying that the Labor leaders are pushing out to do that, but they know that's what's on the other side. So they can play a lowest common denominator, especially now that they've parlayed with the press. It seems like the Murdoch-led, very concentrated press in this country has struck some kind of status quo with Albo now, knowing that they've probably got another term in them. It's asked them to kind of come to the middle, and it's getting a fairly good deal. I mean, we just saw what happened in Washington there. You had 85% of the Australian press and the other 15% being from the Australian, who are just like batshit crazy against anything in the sovereign interest. But we weren't able to get a good bead on what that actual visit was, because it seems like Labor's also covered in these big decisions by the press now, and they've got the stamp from Washington. So, I mean, you talk about carrying over and keeping promises. Unfortunately for Labor, they decided very early in their election campaign, those promises were going to be tax cuts and AUKUS. Two abominations from Scott Morrison. One of them, AUKUS, was scribbled on the back of a napkin, amongst the series of secret phone calls with Mike Pompeo. And the fact that Labor was left out of the actual negotiation period beforehand, to even discuss the matter, just smacked of a disrespect and a complete and utter lack of, fairness to the process. And now you've got someone like Miles, stepping up to be the champion of AUKUS in ways that I think the coalition could only dream of. And I want to ask you a little bit about how, why is Labor choosing to step forward on these things, as you say? Like, the two biggest cards in their pocket they're carrying around are former Morrison policies. So can you tell me a little bit more about what's motivating that?
Well, if I knew I'd be able to get it changed, but look, I think there has always been this view within Australian politics that we need this great protector. And, if you read some of the discussions that are out there, some of the books that are out there now, we've always been reliant on the UK. Then we became reliant on the US. Going back, we were sort of carved out to be the quarry of the world. And that's how things seem to have panned out. So, look, there's always been that view that we cannot survive in, the Asia Pacific without a great protector. I think it's a nonsense. you talk about Paul Keating and neoliberalism, but Paul Keating actually understood very clearly the need to engage in Asia, the need to engage in our own backyard and move away from from imperialism, move away from, God, Queen, and country. So that was a good thing. And if you look at the opposition to AUKUS now, I'm aligned with people that I've fought most of my political career. Paul Keating, Bob Carr, Gareth Evans, all of the right. But they understand the difficulties and the problems of these issues. So I've got no problem, supporting their position on this. And, the first I ever really started considering the relationship with the US to the extent I have been recently was when I read Malcolm Fraser's book, Dangerous Allies.
Mm.
And here was Malcolm Fraser, a conservative prime minister, a defense minister, came out and basically said, we must cut these ties with the US. It's dangerous for Australia and we need to do something different. Since then, there's been many other, books written on this. And, for anyone who really wants to understand it, they really need to start reading the history of Australia and look at the implications of what's happening. Labour talk about being considered, making considered decisions. What is considered about signing up to a $368 billion at least contract with the US after 24 hours? What's considered about signing an agreement that does not deliver an outcome or a good for the country? What's considered about buying nuclear attack submarines whose only job will be not to defend Australia, but to assist the US if they attack China? These are crazy decisions. They are not considered. They are ill-considered. They should be changed.
So going back to this champion status that Labor seems to have for things like AUKUS, now we can safely say that AUKUS is entirely Labor's baby. Because it has been implemented by them. They've ridden the waves. They've taken the bad news. They've had the opportunities to step out due to some of the bad news. I mean, there are some clauses in place right now, and some geopolitical developments that could see us pull out of AUKUS relatively unscathed and maintain a fairly good relationship with the United States in the process. It feels desperate almost seeing Miles trying to get a hallway meeting with Hegseth, who's got a couple of gins in him, and they're running around the place like pork chops, trying to flag down our great security umbrella to get some kind of guarantee, more than a few hallway words, that this is worth more than it actually is. I mean, we're not even looking at submarines here. You've got joint congressional defense groups sort of saying, look, these Connecticut shipyards are never going to produce the amount of submarines that you're going to need. And in a ramping up great power competition, any of these assets are going to be highly regarded and needed by the United States, potentially including ours. So yeah, it flies against reason in many ways. And it's not just Malcolm Fraser, it's Malcolm Turnbull as well. I mean, we have like pretty much a mainstream ex-parliamentarians and politicians and prime ministers all the way up till the ScoMo era. And I would say even Tony Abbott might be a bit critical of something like this behind closed doors. Why is this new generation in Canberra charging ahead with this for anything other than personal gain? I mean, we see what's happening with hockey and Pine and, some of the deals that are happening. ScoMo's cutting some deals in his own private life. So is there there some personal gain here, or is there just a sovereign, is there delusion?
Oh, I think it's a big call to say there'll be personal gain. I've got no doubt that some of the existing Labour cabinet ministers will end up working in the defence industry when they leave politics. That's terrible from my perspective. I don't think there's anyone on the take in the Labour cabinet. I mean, the reality is that there's always been within Labour an American lobby. And, that's always been there, probably always will be there. And that's why, from my perspective, coming from the left, I always argued that we had to be careful about this, that we had to sort of try and cut our own, future in Asia, and why I agree with, Paul Keating in those issues. Malcolm Turnbull, I think, also understood this, and that's why he went for these French submarines. What really annoys me at the moment is that every time you hear a Labour politician on talking about AUKUS, they're talking about jobs, right? And, these will be the most expensive job creation initiatives, and I use that word in inverted commas, ever. How many jobs could you create for 368 billion if you created a modular housing industry, which would build, modern, well-designed, cheap to run through power and electricity houses, built in factories, creating good jobs, creating union jobs. This is what we should be looking at, not spending this money on, attacking our most important trading partner, China.
And, it's just ridiculous. I mean, considering that the French had set up in the South Australian shipyards and, there were actual jobs actually going, people were actually going to work and getting paid for those jobs with that French connection. And now, what have we got? Maybe a couple of nuclear waste disposal jobs. I wanted to speak to you a little bit about that tradition that Labor has, being very intimate, its relationship with the United States, but also with Zionism and the state of Israel. We say that AUKUS was, essentially Labor's baby because they have seen it through from its creation. But another complete Labor perspective or experience has been their cradle to grave handling of the Gaza crisis and their relationship with Israel. I want to harken back to 2010. When Stephen Smith sent home Israeli diplomat for the forged passport incidents. Essentially, there's rumors that led to pressure that led to Rudd's removal. There was some talk in his memoirs about that, about being approached by a Zionist lobby. And then within weeks, he was no longer in his job. Julia Gillard ended up being one of the most pro-Zionist Australian prime ministers in history. I did want to ask you a little bit about what the difference is today with Labor. I mean, Labor now holds diplomatic, economic and military normacy with Israel over 2 years into a UN declared genocide. It hasn't sent home a diplomat. It hasn't done anything. It's been listening to Israeli IDF intelligence that isn't reliable to make domestic decisions. So I want to ask you what's changed in the period between Rudd and today with the Labor Party. And if you could share a little bit of information about Labor's history with the state of Israel and Zionism.
Well, I think to understand Labour's position, you can go back to Bob Hawke, and when Israel actually had the equivalent of a Labour Party in Israel, The kibbutz approach was there. People saw Israel as, being a go-ahead country that was, going to make a big difference. And, as I said, Bob Hawke was a strong supporter of Israel, and there's always been a strong support base for Israel in the Labour Party. To understand the broader, complexity of this, those that are listening should read Clinton Fernandez. The books that Clinton Fernandez has written. It explains, the link not only with Israel, but the link back into the US. And we've got that group of countries. We've got the US, as the hegemonic nation in the world. We've got Australia as the deputy sheriff in Asia. We've got Japan as is going to be the deputy sheriff by the looks of it. You've got Israel as a deputy sheriff in the Middle East, and you've got the UK. So, I mean, this is all linked, this relationship, and it goes back to our reliance on the British Empire and now the US Empire. So these are issues that are not new. And, what I'm concerned about is that so many members of the Labour Party who were strong supporters when I was in Parliament and, were members of groups, the politicians groups who supported Palestine have been mute since the
including the founder of the Parliamentary Friends of Palestine, the Prime Minister himself.
Yeah, well, yes. And, it just beggars belief that we're in that position. And we just seem to have this reflex action. Every time America is in a war, we are standing shoulder to shoulder with them. And, if you look at people like Tom Uren, who actually were in a war, came back as peace activists. That's the sort of thing that people don't realize. They think, a conflict is going to be like a war game on the computer. It's not going to be like that at all. It's going to be much more deadly than it's ever been, because this position of, simply supporting Israel, simply supporting America against China could lead to nuclear war. And that's a big problem. And I don't think there's any articulation of this or any debate or any critical analysis in the Labour Party at the moment on these issues.
You're speaking to something there that I kind of identify with a little bit too. And I mean, I see it with a lot of my friends and myself, a lot of my political compass and the way I see peace, and I'm an anti-war writer. I mean, that's primarily what I'm writing about at the moment. And it's the same with yourself. I think people that, it seems that people that come from backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, working class backgrounds that have, had direct influence or affected by war, seem to have this position more often than not. And right now in Canberra, there's less people like yourself. There's less fitters and turners, and there's more people that are career politicians. People without that lived experience, people without the loss and the trauma that comes with it. And I often wonder if we're sort of lacking voices like this now in our modern major political parties. I mean, even on the other side of politics, you look at the Nationals, for example, and you see just like the lack of ability for the Nationals to sort of make an impact now with with their voters. So what does he speak to this bubble in Canberra? I wonder how, if Zionism is a part of that ignorance, the approach that Labor has to Zionism, which is, very easy to sort of pick apart these days. If it's just running off an autopilot, and, and I'm speaking to the bubble here, is there a lot of ignorance now in our political class that sees them unable to see a modular housing program, or to see the folly of, calling in America for a security umbrella? Is there something to that?
Well, I suppose not many current parliamentarians would have had their parents in a war. I mean, that's the reality. Apart from,
Does it speak out to Ed Husick and Fatima Payman? The two people that actually did have those experiences have been marginalized within the party?
Well, it could be, but my main concern is that there is a lack of understanding about what militarism means, and tying yourself to the US and UK military industrial complex, and trying to, revive manufacturing in Australia through militarism in the military industrial complex. It's crazy. I grew up as a teenager in Scotland. You could see the damage that war causes on families and individuals. For instance, my father served in Burma with the expeditionary forces behind the Japanese lines in Burma. He came back from war an alcoholic, regular bouts of malaria, and we had to deal with that as a family. And we were not the only ones that had to deal with it, because families across Scotland and the UK were in that position, because the working class are the ones that get dragooned into the army and have to go and fight the war for the ruling class, and
Right.
Really there doesn't seem to be an appreciation of that in Labour at the moment. And this sort of, well, it's all the way with the USA, is crazy. It's absolute crazy. I don't think it's going to last. I think you'll find more and more of a reaction against this approach on AUKUS. You're going to find a bigger reaction again as Israel seemed determined to breach any long-lasting peace in Palestine. We really need leaders, and we need parliamentarians who actually fight for peace and not hide behind the argument that we're buying nuclear attack submarines to defend Australia. We're not buying them to do that. We're buying them to attack China. And that's the situation we're in. So the leadership in the party are not being honest with Australians. We have now signed over to what is basically a permanent US base in Australia for Marines, for nuclear armed bombers, for nuclear armed submarines. That was never contemplated, never accepted. Back in even Hawke's day, when there was a rebellion against America testing missiles near Australia, the MX missiles, the left stood up and said, we are not going to cop this. This must be stopped. And Hawke was forced to back down. There is nothing like that happening in the party at the moment.
Because there seemed to be a lot more people willing to challenge the orthodoxies at the party, and there were people allowed a space within the party to be able to do that. You know, I'm not old enough to have been at those national conventions and things like that, but you were. You know, I imagine there were a few fists thrown at some of these things by the end of the night. But there was.
I don't know about that.
Okay, but what I'm saying is like there was a lot of argy-bargy by the looks of it. For me, looking back, there was a lot more kinetic shoulder rubbing, a lot more rubbing people the wrong way. And, you know, that seems to be missing now. You know, there seems to be this broad church element, you know, this John Howard kind of approach to leadership from Albanese. I call him the Fox FM. I call him the Fox FM PM. And, you know, for someone who grew up on the working left, who feels like a man without a country these days, you know, I see them talking about this being the left alternative. You know, so Albanese, Burke and Wong are the Labor left. This is as left as Labor's ever going to be. And they can't even put forward, they can't even mention public housing, you know. They can't even mention taxing the rich or finding some way to actually commandeer back our profits for our resources. So the thing that really hurts here is that there's many people on the left that feel completely disenfranchised on the working left, many of whom are union payers, but don't feel like Labor's been representing them for decades. They look across to the Greens and they see a group of people that don't represent them and who they are. And then they're kind of like lambs to the slaughter. Because, you know, people start experimenting with different ideologies based to all the information that's coming through. So you got like people that were, you know, proud trade unionists, Labor voters, experimenting with Pauline Hanson or experimenting with the Greens. And then finding out on both sides that they're not really getting what they want. And the people that they're talking to in these parties don't really give a shit about the working. Then they go to the unions and they find the unions are hamstrung because there is stuck between this kind of deal making that constantly happens with the ALP. And it seems like small potatoes. And this makes me think of someone we're missing right now in the Labor left. And, you know, potentially I would have thought you were this person one day, Doug, so don't get too offended. But where's Jeremy Corbyn in Australia? You know, where is this figure, this disenfranchised former Labor person like yourself, who stands up for those values and actually champions a movement based on the former DNA and muscle memory of the Labor Party to address and to speak to the Australian workers? That's my question to you, Doug.
I don't feel disenfranchised. I just feel that I've got to fight for the historic values of peace, the historic values of decent wages, decent working conditions. Nothing in my mind has changed facing the working class in Australia. And I think the big problem that I have argued for some time is that when we had strong unions, and we had unions like the AMWU, the Metal Workers Union, people like Laurie Carmichael and John Halfpenny understood the benefits of union education and education in general. And we could put thousands of well-trained union delegates out on the job, capable of arguing against one nation, capable of arguing against militarism, capable of critically analysing what the boss was saying, what the Murdoch press were saying, and they became leaders on the job. And I've argued we need to massively increase union education in Australia. One thing the Labour government should do is it should fund, as it did in the past, a proper union education centre like the Clyde Cameron College, where unionists can go and get educated about the issues that are facing the working class so that they can go back on the job and articulate the reasoning for opposing AUKUS, the reasoning for getting decent taxation. So they are trained in economics, they are trained on social issues, they are trained on industrial issues, That's missing to a great extent.
But so are friendly ears in the party of the worker, right, Doug? I mean, like it's one thing putting those things in place. And as someone who was a union delegate myself and worked on the coalface, I sort of know about these frustrations. But it does feel like when you're running the letter upstairs, you're not getting that traction from the party of the worker. I mean, that's why I ask about this Jeremy Corbyn-like figure. If there was someone in this country that was speaking to those levels at that higher, to those issues at a higher level, it would be a very unifying sort of movement. Just the fact that Max Chandler-Mather was at the CFMEU rally the other year, I think just sort of summed up the way things are going right now. Like there hasn't been, since Albo really, there hasn't been a Labor leader that's been willing to sort of stake themselves standing in front of a union crowd and claiming to be proud union. So is this also an obstacle?
I think that's overstated. I must say I attended many union meetings when I was a senator. I think there is an engagement with the union movement constantly, but the issue that's missing is the capacity to inject alternative points of view within the party. I gave the Carmichael lecture recently, and I indicated there that that it seems to me that the left have been defanged and are mute on these issues.
Yep.
And I think that's part of the sort of overreaction to the years of disunity in the party. And the argument that you need to have this total solidarity to be re-elected. That's never been the case in Australian politics, ever. So I don't get why, this premium is being placed on everyone saying the same thing, doing the same thing, not critiquing the policies that the party is adopting. I think that's a recipe for disaster. And you talk about, you mentioned John Howard earlier. The reason John Howard ended up getting kicked out was that there was no one in the party, in the Liberal Party, prepared to take the issues up with the leader. So he ran his own agenda. And I think that's a real problem for Albo if there is no voices in the Labour Party offering an alternative, offering a critique, and actually standing up against some of the bad policy decisions that are being made.
So this could be a potential crisis point here. I mean, with Labor having such a large mandate, but it being reticent to actually put forward any change. I mean, it's going to echo through the electorate as they see this party not actually doing what it could with its power. And then over time too, Albo's popularity will wane as, a resurgent coalition or conservative movement.
Every prime minister's popularity wanes. Everyone. It's not just Albo.
But this is the thing, right? Like, I mean, people don't last forever. You don't live forever. You can't take it with you. And Albo's always to the Urans and the Whitlams and these great champions and he conjures ghosts when he talks about when he just speaks about ideas but doesn't do anything about them. So what's the danger of constantly calling upon the former greats to deliver neoliberal kind of goop? And what does it say to Albanese as a leader and what his legacy is? I mean, we were tricked into thinking Albanese was this kind of like working class hero that was all about legacy and leaving something in place. But this seems to be about a party obsessed with politics and obsessed with preserving itself at all costs. I was wondering if you could shed a bit of light on that.
Well, look, I've been I was a mate of Albo's for decades. Um, I'm not here to personalize any attack on any Labour politician. I am keen to critique the policies, not the individual. And I am happy to argue against AUKUS. I'm happy to argue for public housing. I'm happy to argue for more social welfare spending. I'm happy to argue that we need to look after those that can't look after themselves. I'm happy to argue we need to build a good society. And I'm more than happy to argue against militarism, warlike nonsense, and tying ourselves to the US. These are issues that need to be debated within Australia because the disaster that we're heading for could be nuclear war unless there's more voices in this country that tries to distance themselves from, the autocratic, nearly fascist Trump regime. Now, I don't buy the argument that that we've got shared values with the US. We don't share the values of the US, of the racism in the US. We don't share the values that the US places on militarism. So we don't share all the values of the US. But what we do is rely on China for the standard of living that we have. I looked at it recently. I retired to Tasmania. Tasmania, if we don't export to China, $3 billion comes out the Tasmanian economy. It's tough enough in Tasmania for working class people. But without that capacity to export to China, we're going to be in real trouble. And no politician is explaining the implications of Chinese imports stopping, of our exports to China stopping. Nobody's doing that. And militarism and this false, bullshit, that we've got the same values as the US, just is crazy nonsense. So we need to change that. And that can only be done through educating the working class, educating our MPs, educating our leaders on these issues.
With a neoliberal, politically obsessed Labor government and its alternative option in Canberra, we're not going to maybe get that
You're
traction.
pretty good at branding, but I got to tell you,
look, mate,
you got to get a bit of balance in where we're at. Labor does some good things, but in my view, they are being diminished by militarism. They are being diminished by, simply hanging off the coattails of the Trump regime. And even when people say to me, "Oh, but Trump's going to go," I don't think Trumpism will disappear in the US for decades to come. Decades.
Well, America first is something that's here to stay. And I mean, after Trumpism, it's only going to evolve. And we're already seeing the return of, say, Monroe Doctrine policies with Venezuela and Cuba and things like this, pointing towards a bit of a change in the international status quo too. So where Australia is, and where it could be, requires a whole bunch of sovereign imagination, sovereign creativity, and sovereign consciousness, which our political class doesn't seem to possess. When you see Richard Marles, aping forward with AUKUS, when you see Murray Watt just signing over the Northwest Pipeline like his predecessor would have done, project, sorry. So what really is standing out for me as someone who's very sovereign focused and who cares a lot about Australia's sovereign future is that our bipartisan political class, unfortunately, with Albanese government as well, has not got that sovereign periphery. It hasn't been able to see the region as well as we would like. And look, we can say they're playing a really tricky diplomatic game right now. We're being too hard on Labor. That Penny Wong's making some great gains in Southeast Asia, and they're trying to kind of manage their relationship with the United States. But I argue, who the hell got us into this situation to begin with? You know, and if we are taking some like tactical backward steps, it's because we've been trudging forward too much on a whim. And now we've got people like yourself, not disenfranchised, but quite critical of the trajectory of the party. And it doesn't seem to be with a mandate in the bag. It seems like they feel like they've had their victory and they can do things the way they want. So, I mean, what's the incentive for Labor to actually come back? You know, it's got another term in the bag. What is the incentive to Labor to come back and, you know, look at a public housing program, you know, where it's done the political calculus and it probably feels it can win in this John Howard kind of iteration?
Look, I think the incentive is that they don't want to have to face another like Vietnam moratorium campaign.
So they're politically focused and obsessed again.
I think they need to understand that if they continue to go down this path with the US, that there will be an increasing organizational approach from, you know, social welfare groups, peace groups, political groups, all coming together to argue against it. And then the big danger for Labour will be that you'll get progressive, you know, not the Teals, but the equivalent of a progressive Teal force working against Labour. And that will mean a lot of the MPs that are there now won't be there at the next election if that gets ahead of steam up. So I think there's an incentive for Labour not to make the same mistakes that the Liberals did, and that is get too carried away with their engagement with the US, with their own political theories, and not understand the main issues facing working class Australians who are the majority in the country. And that is the cost of living, you know, educating their kids, being able to get a home. They don't have to own it, but getting a home that they can live in, making sure they can put food on the table, that their kids' health and their health is looked after. These are the priorities. But what are we getting at the moment? We just get this never-ending defense of AUKUS and the argument that AUKUS is going to be the resurrection of the manufacturing sector in Australia. It is militaristic nonsense. It is just beyond belief, that argument.
I think you say something really important there too. And I mean, it points out the order of priorities for Labor right now. I mean, it's there to serve the alliance. It's there to serve Zionist interests. It's there to serve mining interests. It's there to serve interests of the business class. But where does the Australian workers' interest on those order priorities fit in? And I mean, look, it can be scoffed at, it could be laughed at, but sitting over here on this side where I'm not making too much money and I'm under a lot of financial stress, like a lot of Australians, yeah. We do ask the question quite often, who are these guys standing for? And it will be, as you say, an only matter of time before people like myself become much more engaged in another form of expression, which is the ballot box. And, you know, I'm hoping that people like yourself can help to lead a campaign like that in the future. I know you're at the party for life and you're a lifer there, but, you know, we didn't get to answer that Jeremy Corbyn question, but you know, I think there is a cultural factor and a few other things that might be inhibiting the next Jeremy Corbyn from standing up. And it could be you, Doug, but it could be a whole bunch of people. So let's hope we find them, huh?
Yeah. Well, I would just rather the Labour Party, who were, you know, brought to life to represent the working class, actually gets back to its roots. That's what I'd like to see.
So how do we commandeer it? How does a bloke like me get into a Labor Party meeting without being bujeered out of the room within about 8 minutes? Because that's generally what happens, right?
Well, I don't think at a Labour Party branch meeting you would. I think the party is the sort of the leadership is becoming more remote from the branches. I mean, I go to my branch meeting down here and put up resolutions on for Labour against war, resolutions on AUKUS, resolutions on housing, all agreed to at the branch level.
Yeah.
It's further up that it disappears. And that's the big problem with Labour at the moment, that they seem to be the party is out of touch with the membership, and the left of the Labour Party being defined and mute is not a good thing for the party.
Thank you very much, Doug, for your insights. And it seems like the takeaway there is that there is a revivalism on the cards for the Australian working left somewhere. And it might be in Labor's best interest to look to accommodate that in the future, or else it might end up as, another party completely, right?
Well, yeah, that's always the danger. But, I have been a member of the Labour Party since the 1970s. People ask me, why don't I resign? I don't want to resign and then just disappear. I want to continue fighting within the party for the principles that I believe are the real, genuine Labour principles. That is peace, that is a decency, that is ensuring that workers get a fair go. And I will always fight for that. And if you simply resign and walk away, given this how we are set up politically here, the chances of getting delivery on that are minimal. If every Green member had stayed in the Labour Party, it would be a different Labour Party now.
Yeah, and if every Labor leader looked towards the actual working class rather than the Business Council of Australia, it'd be a different party now too. But look, I definitely hear you, and look, coming from both sides of the fence here, it's a pleasure to meet you, Doug. And yeah, you seem like a character that that the Labor Party is lucky to have within their rank and file at the moment. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Joel.